In this video, we're going to talk about computer programming workflow. And by workflow, I mean that there are a certain number of steps that you'll take in every project that you create, and there are certain things that have to happen in each of these steps. The first step is the planning phase. This is where you determine what you're going to build and how you're going to build it, how you'll test it, and how you will deploy it. And for the purpose of this video, we're going to create a plan just using our Notepad application and decide how we're going to build a Social Security benefit taxation calculator. This will simply tell people whether or not they'll be liable to taxation for their Social Security benefits based on the rest of their income and their filing status. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a single Windows form, and it's going to ask the user for certain values such as their marital tax filing status, whether they're filing single, filing married jointly, or married filing separately, their income, their tax-exempt interest income, and then also any Social Security benefits that they got throughout the year. We'll use the calculation that we can get from the IRS website to determine whether or not they'll be liable to actually paying some amount to the IRS for their Social Security benefits. Now ideally, I'd also maybe draw out what the application will look like on a piece of paper and define some more information about how it will perform the calculation and so on. However, for the purpose of this video, we're going to keep this rather brief. However, the more planning that you do, the more success that you'll have in your development effort. The next thing we'll do is define exactly how we're going to test our application to ensure that it's giving us the results that we expected. In this case, I want to make sure that all the fields are filled out before trying to perform the calculation, and make sure that the user entered the correct data type. In other words, they can't enter the word 10 when they mean the number 10 into a text box. And we want to make sure that the user doesn't enter a value that's too large or too small. And finally, we want to make sure that the calculation is accurate. So we want to test it against any other calculators that, for example, we might find on the internet that calculates this exact same type of information. We'll want to scrutinize the results and ensure that we're getting the exact calculation that we're trying to achieve. And also during the planning phase, we want to plan out how we're going to actually deploy the application. In this case, we're going to plan on sending it to 2 people within our company and get some feedback from them. And again, this is all fictitious. But we may also want to test it for a week or so and then put it out on the company's website for download. Now again, I have greatly abbreviated this step. The more time you spend planning, the better success you'll enjoy when you actually go to develop your application. Conversely, there's also something known as analysis paralysis, where you spend so much time analyzing and planning for the application that you never start building it. So there's always this balance that you seek in how much time you spend actually planning. But for the most part, programmers are guilty of doing too little instead of doing too much analysis and planning for their application development. The tendency is always to get right into VisualStudio.net and start developing. And you should spend some time up front doing some planning work. Now that I've finished the planning phase, I'm going to move on to the next phase within our application development workflow or application development lifecycle, and that is the development phase. And this is where we'll use VisualStudio.net to build the application using its many code and visual designers according to the plan that we specified in the previous step. Now what I want to do is show you the complete development of this application, and I'm not going to say very much during the development phase. I'm just going to let you watch and see generally how I move through the tool in order to build a Windows Forms application that adheres to the plan that I created. So in this portion of the video, I don't want you to concentrate so much on how I did it or what I did, as much as just getting a general understanding of the steps that I'm taking as I'm dragging and dropping items onto designers, and as I get into the actual code and type or paste code into the code window. And then I'll come back and I'll explain a little bit about this. But over the next 20 or so lessons in this series, I will explain more and more about how to achieve the results that I got while developing this application. And so again, this is meant to be a very broad overview. And please don't get discouraged if you don't understand exactly what I'm doing. You're not supposed to at this point. Just watch. Take some labels and put them onto our design surface. I know I need about 5 of them over here, and I'm going to put one over on the right hand side. Put some text boxes. And I know I need some radio buttons. And we'll move them around. And I also need some buttons. Actually, let's move these around a little bit. Using my keyboard, I'm going to move them around with the arrow keys. I'm going to expand this label area out a little bit. And here I'm going to select this and type in pull this out so it can fit all the text there. Alright, so let's move over here, and we're going to make a single status, a married filing jointly, and then a married filing separately. And then I'm going to remove the text that's by default in the text box and change it to the number 0. And I'm going to get rid of all text in that label, and I'm going to change its border style so that it stands out and make it fixed 3D. Then I'm going to name each of these, for example, rad single, rad married jointly, and name this one rad married separately. And let's name this one regular income. And this one we're going to name tax exempt income. And we'll name this one total SS benefit. And we'll name this one LBL answer. And then here we're going to change the text. Well, first of all, we'll name it BTN OK. And let's change the text of it to OK. And we'll change the text of this one to cancel. And we'll call this one BTN cancel. Great. Let's go ahead and get rid of that and start moving things around and lining them up nicely. Make sure they all line up nicely to the left-hand side as well as the right. And let's resize our form and then give the form itself a title. And we'll call this Social Security Benefits Taxation. And I'm going to save it all. Okay. So I finished basically laying out my user interface for the application. I apologize for it taking so long, but I wanted you to see the entire process of dragging and dropping items, moving them around, and we're going to get into all of this in future videos. But I just want you to sit back and watch over my shoulder as I develop an application. Now, this application won't do very much by itself. Here, I'm going to hit this little button which will actually run the application in kind of a test mode to see what it does so far. So I'm going to go ahead and click the little button, and now this little window pops open, and I can click, and when I do these radio buttons, notice automatically they just deselect one and select the one I just clicked on. Notice that also I've got my text boxes with zeros by default, and my buttons, they don't really do anything right now. So we've got some more work to do. We're going to have to write some code in order to change what is viewed on the interface by the end user. The next step in the development is to actually write code that will respond to the events that are fired from our form application. And so when somebody clicks on the OK button, we want something to happen. So instead of forcing you to watch me type out lines and lines of code, what I'm going to do is paste in some code that I have on my clipboard. Again, we'll come back and explain what I'm doing a little bit later. And I'm going to need to double click on the cancel button and add some code there as well. Okay, so I pretty much finished my development phase at this point. I have created my GUI, the part of the application that the user interfaces with, and then I've also written code that will react to the different events that are fired off by the user's interaction with the application. In other words, what happens when they click OK or when they click cancel. So this moves us into the next phase, which is the testing phase. This is where we test the application's inputs and outputs to ensure that the application performs as planned. So what we'll do is kind of what we did a little bit earlier, where we ran or tested the application by clicking this little start button. And then we'll just fill in some information here and see what results we get. We'll say $10,000 of regular income, some interest income of $5,000, and a benefit of $20,000, and click OK. and it says no, you won't have to pay taxes on Social Security benefits. How about if we up some of these numbers to 20 and to 15, and we'll click OK. And yes, we'll have to pay taxes on Social Security benefits. Let's go ahead and play around with this a little bit and type in a value that's non-numeric and click OK. We get a message box that says please use numeric values in the regular income box. Okay, so what we'll do at this point is just, according to our plan, go through and test the application to ensure that we get what we're expecting and that it doesn't have any serious bugs. Now, what you saw was a very abbreviated look at the development and the testing. What really happens is that there's different types of testing. For example, when I'm actually writing the code, I will run it maybe 10, 20, 50 times, even with a small application like this, just to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything and I don't get any error messages. Then once I feel like the application is complete, I'll go through another round of testing it to make sure that it all works from top to bottom, instead of just testing each little piece individually as I went through and developed it. I want to look at testing it from a whole application perspective. So now that we've pretty much finished the plan, develop, and testing phases, let me just take a brief moment here to overview the steps that I took to create this application. First of all, let me move this down a little bit. First of all, the first thing that I did was I went to File, New, Project, which brought up this New Project dialog. I selected that I wanted to use a template from the Visual C# projects. I want to create a Windows application. You'll notice that there's a lot of different types of applications I could build, including a smart device application that runs on a PDA or a cell phone, an ASP.NET web application that runs on a web server and can be accessed from the internet, and just a whole bunch of other potential projects that I can create. And we'll go into a couple of those in this series, and then obviously on LearnVisualStudio.net there are many videos on how to create projects from the rest of these templates. Then I gave it a name and a location. I clicked OK. I'm going to click Cancel this time. But the next thing that happened was that it created some files over here on the right-hand side, and we see this hierarchical breakdown of those files. First of all, notice that it created a solution. And basically a solution helps you to organize the source code into one or more projects. So underneath the solution you see that there's a project. And a project organizes source code by gathering all the files necessary to create an assembly, plus any other resources. And if you recall, an assembly is what actually gets deployed to the end user's computer so they can run your application. So in this case, what we have is an icon, a .ico file, and a form1.cs that I'm actually working in. This is actually comprised of more than just one file, though. If we select this Show All Files, you can see that some of these have little pluses next to them. When I drill down and click the plus, it shows that there are files underneath those that compose a given form. So some files, or some, like for example that form actually has several files associated with it, when all pulled together create a given object such as a form. So again, let's not dwell on that too much. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. One of the first things that I did was I started changing the properties of this form by stretching it, resizing it to a given shape, and then I use this little tool palette that jettisons out from the left-hand side and dragged and dropped labels and text boxes and buttons and radio buttons onto our design surface and moved them around using either my mouse or using the arrow keys on my keyboard. And then I also selected items and went over here to this little properties area in the lower right hand corner by default and changed the text properties, and I also changed the name of those items. So the text property is what the user sees, the name is what the computer sees and what it recognizes whenever we start developing. And I'll go over that again in a future video. Then the final thing that we did was added some code to the buttons, and notice whenever I clicked on a button it brought up a little section of code. I pasted some code in here, and that code occurs, or that code runs rather, whenever the btn OK, that OK button, gets clicked. So you can see that it's an event driven handler for what the users do on the interface, and we write code that responds to that particular event. And the same would be true then for the cancel button. Whenever I double click on this, it brings open the code view again, and when the btn cancel button is clicked, then what I did was selected this.close, which will shut down the form, close the form, and end the application. So that's what I did at a very high level. Again, this was only meant to give you a general sense of workflow and not to teach you the specifics of developing applications. That's what the next 20 lessons or so are all about. Now let's take a look at some of the code itself. You'll notice that as we look through it that there are some unique things about it that we can learn from just right off the bat. Notice that some words are in blue, some words are in black, some words are in green, and then we have like this aqua colored set of numbers off here to the left hand side. And you'll notice that we use a lot of these brackets, and that at the end of every line you'll see that there is a semicolon. So these are some of the characteristics of writing applications in C#. The blue text, the blue words, are keywords that are reserved for C#. And you'll come to know many of the keywords and what they mean through this series of videos, as well as the rest of the videos on LearnVisualStudio.net. The black words are identifiers and variables and things of that nature. Again, we'll talk about that more in a future video. The green text are comments that we type in. These do not get compiled into our assembly whenever we create a .NET application, but they're just simply for reminding ourselves and others what this particular section of code is attempting to do. So in this case, this whole little try-catch section of code that I'm highlighting with my mouse, what I'm trying to do with that section of code is obtain the regular income value from the form. So whatever the user typed in, I want to take that value and read it into my application. And we'll talk about this more later again. The numbers down the left-hand side are an option that I selected so that I could view the line numbers. So this is just an easy way for me to refer to what line number is either having a problem, or when I'm discussing an application with one of my coworkers, I can say, just take a look at line number 251, and then he can take a look in his version of our code and see, oh yeah, I see what you did there. Just an easy way to refer to lines of code. And you'll notice that there are the open and closing brackets all over the place. And that is used to group code together that must be run kind of as a set. So if one option is selected, one group of code might run, and if another option or something occurs in the application, another section of code might run. But it keeps this all kind of partitioned together, and we'll talk about that more again in the future. And then also, unlike Visual Basic, the way that you instruct the computer and let it know that you're finished with a particular line of code or line of instructions is through the use of the semicolon. Now there's some common mistakes that occur whenever you're developing C# applications that you need to be aware of. The first one is that you might forget one of these little semicolons. I know you're a perfect typist, but this eventually will happen to you. In which case you start to see a little red squiggly line to remind you that something's missing. If I were to try to run the application at this point, I've introduced a bug, and I get a little message box that says there were build errors. Continue, and at this point you would say yes, but the application will just end and will not work correctly. So we'll want to put that there. And also, if I were to mistype, and maybe not even mistype a letter, but capitalize something that shouldn't be capitalized, this will cause an error as well. So I'm going to try and run now. And again, it says there were build errors. Continue. And it'll show me where the error is. It says the name regular income does not exist in the class. So from that I understand that there's a problem. See this little blue squiggly line underneath regular income. And I might say to myself, well, I thought I typed it correctly, and so you have to be very careful about choosing the correct case. And so these are some of the challenges, the small challenges that you undertake whenever you use C# as your primary development language. That you're going to have these little syntactical idiosyncrasies that are going to frustrate you at first, but then become just commonplace in your mind, and you'll be able to adapt to this quite easily over time. So don't get discouraged. Everybody goes through a certain period of time where they expect capitalization or spelling, or forgetting to use brackets, or these little semicolons at the end of lines, that they expect the program to still work even though that they have typed the instructions in incorrectly, and it simply won't work, but you get over it over time. Alright, we're almost finished, but there's one step left in our workflow, and that is going to the deployment phase. And this is where we make sure that the application is ready to be distributed, and then following our plan to ensure that the application is ready for use. And what we'll do is create an install program so our application can be installed on other people's computers. And this will call upon something that we talked about a little bit earlier, where we said a solution can have multiple projects. And up to this point, we only have one project, which is the actual application. But now we're going to add a new project to our solution, and that is an installation, or rather deployment project, in order to create an installation program that places the files and settings for our program on the desired computer. And to do that, what we're going to select is File, New, Project. We want to make sure that we select Add to Solution first of all before we go any further. If we forget to do this, we will shut down the current solution and create a new one, and that's not what we want to do. The next thing I'm going to select is Project Types, and then select Setup Project, and we can call it anything we want to. I'm just going to call this Social Security Tax Benefits, or Benefit Taxation Setup. And click OK. And after a moment or two, VisualStudio.net will add a new project to the solution. So you can see if I roll these up by clicking the minus signs, that there are now two projects within my solution. And this little icon to the left of the name that I called my setup project indicates that this is a setup project as opposed to just a C# project. Now let me suggest that there are many settings that we can make to customize the way that our program is set up on the end user's computer. But for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to make any changes to our setup project. It should work just the way that it is. Now the first thing I'm going to do is change from debug mode to release mode. And we'll talk about this more later, but essentially this just means that we're all ready to deploy our application. So the first thing I want to do is build my Lesson 2 application. So I'm going to select Build Lesson 2, and I get this little output window that says 1 succeeded. Then I'm going to select my setup application and select Build the SSBT setup application, and it will create a setup and an MSI that we can actually run on our computer to make sure that it installs correctly. And it says that it succeeded, so let's go ahead and just click off that. And here I'm going to bring up my Windows Explorer from my C drive and navigate to the Begin To folder. And I have the SSBT setup. And here I have the Release folder. And inside here, I see that I have a setup.exe, a setup.ini, and then the MSI. This is the Windows installer package. It's what actually holds most of the information about our project. The setup is just like a boot program that runs pretty much the same no matter what, and the values are only changed by what's in the actual .ini file. Again, don't worry about any of this. We'll go over all this in detail later on. So when I double click it, notice that I get this Welcome to the SSBT Setup Wizard. I chose the default, so I could change this text to be a little more user-friendly. And I'm just going to click Next and choose some options where I want to put it on my hard drive, select Next, and let it install. And after a moment or two, it should finish the installation successfully. And it says click Close. The installation is complete. And so if I run it again, we get another option to repair or to remove the setup and so on. And I'll just click cancel out of this. But you can see that we get a lot of functionality without having to do a whole lot of work. Now, truth be told, we actually needed to set a few more options in order to make this really create an installation. But you get the idea that we get a lot of functionality very easily by using the tools in VisualStudio.net. And now we can take these files and give them to the people in our plan. There were two gentlemen, Jim and Steve, and we were going to let them use the application for a week and then get some feedback, and then after a week or so put it on the company's website for download. So again, we're following our plan, whether we're in our development or testing or deployment phase. So in a nutshell, this was the general workflow that you will have on almost every project you create. Now granted, most of your projects will be a lot more complex than this, and they'll take a lot more time than just 15 or 20 minutes or so. But the same basic steps are applicable across all applications you'll ever build. In Lesson 4, we'll discuss and demonstrate how to create graphical user interfaces using the toolbox and some of the controls that we use in our Social Security benefits taxation program, as well as new controls that we'll introduce in that lesson.